This was the Kanglan continent and the rear mountain forbidden grounds of the Qingyun sect. Autumn wind rolled dead yellow leaves across the ground, and the sacred land felt even more desolate. A figure in a dull gray elder robe gripped a broom with worn bristles and swept the stone steps in a stead. Why, rhythm. Even in a Dao robe, he looked out of place with messy blonde hair and deep-set blue eyes and a high sharp nose. An American named John paused and watched a streak of swordlight fly across the horizon. He muttered in a pure New York accent, so softly only he could hear 3 more days. He had been thrown into this cursed cultivation world for a full 300 years to get home. He had crawled from a foreign drifter who could only say hello into a golden core realm elder of the Qingyun sect. His seniority was high, yet he was the one everyone pushed aside. From top to bottom, the sect called him barbarian. They mocked his strange face and his sloppy look. They hated that he held the richest spiritual qi in the rear mountain forbidden grounds while his realm seemed frozen. No one knew that every shred of spiritual power Zhang gained over 300 years had been fed into the return origin stone, hidden deep in his cave dwelling. He dropped the broom and slipped into the moss-covered stone cave. Like a thief in the middle of the cave, a cracked black stone gave off a faint dim glow. An American named John reached out with a trembling hand, thick with calluses. His fingertips traced the rough surface, and the blue light in his eyes burned hotter than the stone. The energy scale on it was lit to 99%. Only the last sliver was missing. Just endure 3 more days and he could leave this savage world where people killed for treasure. He could go back to New York with hot dogs and coffee and the Statue of Liberty. For these final 3 days, John forced the terror of his power that could shake the heavenly Tao down into the golden core realm. He feared that even the smallest ripple would call down tribulation lightning and destroy the only road home. Outside the cave came a few sharp snickers from young disciples. Passing inner disciples used the barbarian elder for a joke and laughed that he was sweeping the ground. John did not react and only held the return origin stone even more carefully. He guarded it, like an old dog guarding its food, humble and stubborn in this world. Dignity was worth nothing. Only going home was real. Dawn had just pierced the cloud layer. The dead silence that had held the rear mountain forbidden grounds for 300 years shattered under a brutal thunder of noise. The restriction barrier burst apart. Like glass, Zhao Wuji strode in. With 3 discipline hall disciples, their footsteps were heavy and lawless. As if this was not the retreat of a sect elder. As if it was a ruin waiting to be torn down. John was crouched in the center of the herb garden. Both hands cradled a seedling, as if it were fragile porcelain. The plant was jade green from stem to leaf. A faint shimmer flowed across its leaves. It was a top-grade spirit-gathering herb. John had spent 10 years of heart and labor on it. He had nourished it with spiritual power through endless days and nights. It was the only thing that could fill the last 1% of the return origin stone. It was the only thing that could restart the space-time coordinates. Zhao Wuji glanced at the blonde hair of John blazing under the sun. A sneer of open contempt curled at his mouth. He did not need a reason. He flicked a hand. Once the discipline hall disciples behind him spread out like wolves, they called it a routine inspection. It was nothing but a targeted smash and grab. Bottles of spiritual liquid were knocked off the shelves. Rare soil was kicked over. Clods of dirt splattered across the gray robe of John. Washed, nearly white John stayed crouched. Like a stone statue, his lowered lashes hid the storm in his blue eyes. Only his bony up, cagled hands clamped around the spirit-gathering herb. For the activation ritual in 3 days he had to endure to avoid spending even a thread of protective energy from the return origin stone. He had to endure even if his dignity was ground underfoot. He had to endure, but Zhao Wuji clearly did not plan to stop. He stepped right up to John. He did not bother with any technique. He used pure brute force and ripped the spirit-gathering herb away. John reached out by instinct. His fingertips froze a breath from the sleeve of Zhao Wuji. His calloused hand shook hard in midair. From restraint, Zhao Wuji let out a cold lob. Gh. He tossed the seedling to the ground. Like trash, a black satin boot with a thick sole stamped down on it. The boot ground and ground again. A tiny wet sound cracked through the chaos. It was the sound of sap bursting. It was the sound of the road home. Snapping in half, the green leaves collapsed into rotten mud. The mush mixed into dull dust. Not a trace of spiritual coup stirred anymore deep in the cave dwelling. The return origin stone seemed to sense the severed source. Its dim glow sank at once. The energy scale that had been near complete lurched in violent waves. Then it fell quiet in helpless silence. John rose slowly as if his body had turned to iron, his eyes locked on the bright green smear under the boot of Zhao Wuji. Patted the shoulder of John, he leaned close to the ear of John and mocked him, only an uncivilized barbarian like you treats a weed like treasure. Do not let me see this kind of trash on the rear mountain. Again John did not speak. A twitch ran through the muscles of his face, inside his wide sleeves. His fists clenched to the limit, his nails cut deep into his palm. If he did not count the cost, he only needed a thought. He could turn this early golden core fu into ash. He could turn the entire discipline hall into ash. But that instant flare of power would draw the notice of the heavenly Tao. It would also drain the 300 years of energy stored in the return origin stone. John drew in a slow breath. He forced the killing intent that could swallow heaven and earth back down into his gut. Only the last trace of mercy in his blue eyes vanished completely after Zhao Wuji left. John did not explode the way everyone expected. He wiped the mud off his face with his sleeve. His expression did not change. His eyes were calm like a dry well deep in his blue pupils. Cold calculations spun at full speed. Night covered the Qingyun Sect. The Mountain Guardian array shifted into a low-draw cycle. Patrol disciples left brief gaps between their divine sense. Sweeps, a gray-robed shadow slipped into the dark like a ghost. John carried no sword. He held the bald bristled broom he used to sweep dead leaves. He moved without a sound to the back of the cave dwelling of the true disciple Zhao Wuji. John had survived 300 years inside the Qingyun sect. He knew the underground spirit veins better than the sect master. The cave dwelling of Zhao Wuji sat on a prime node called Purple Dawn. Rising, the spirit gathering array there drew from more than the air and the earth. It pulled spiritual chi through hidden conduits. Under the slope, those conduits ran toward an open-air latrine behind the cave. John crouched by a junction and listened to the flow. He did not release any profound spiritual power. He took out a few low-grade spirit stones from his robe. He placed them at key nodes in an 8-direction layout. He followed the logic of airflow and pressure. A tiny spirit reversal array formed with almost no ripple. This array could not kill anyone. Its spiritual power disturbance was so faint, it was nearly nothing. Its only purpose was to exploit a pressure difference. It forcibly drew swamp gas and condensed filth essence that had piled up for 100 years under the latrine. It dragged that foul brew into motion like a pump. It drove it straight into the core array node of the spirit gathering array in the cave of Zhao Wuji. When it was done, John brushed the dust from his hands. He carried the broom and walked away like a nobody. He returned to the rear mountain forbidden grounds, as if nothing happened. The next morning, purple dawn rising lit the sky. It was the best hour for cultivators to breathe in spiritual chi. Zhao Wuji sat cross-legged on a jade couch in the center of his chamber. Pride sat on his face. As he activated the spirit gathering array, he planned to break through to mid-golden core in one push. The array node shuddered. A thick, heavy gas erupted from the node. It poured through the chamber and filled the sealed room. Zhao Wuji felt the surge and thought it was pure essence. He inhaled hard and tried to refine it into his body. In the same breath, a stench smashed into his head. It was not an ordinary smell. It was 5-grain cycle vapors fermented for 100 years. It struck like a brutal physical blow. Zhao Wuji froze mid-breath. His face went pale and then turned green. His eyes bulged as his stomach twisted. Protective true essence flared and faltered. His throat clenched shut and then failed. He gagged and tried to stop breathing. The gas forced its way in. Anyway, he retched so hard his body folded. His abdomen seized and his control collapsed. A thunderous blast erupted from his rear. His body lost all restraint. In an instant, the proud direct disciple let out a scream that did not sound human. He tumbled off the jade couch and crawled out of the chamber. He burst out of the cave in a blind panic. Disciples rushed over. When they heard the chaos, they froze. When they saw him, Zhao Wuji was disheveled and half-dressed. His pant legs was smeared with a yellow-white mess. A choking stink rolled off him in waves. He vomited while he stumbled across the square. He kept spraying filth as he ran. People scattered and covered their faces. Some nearly fainted from the smell. A discipline hall elder arrived with a face like iron. He checked the arrays and found no enemy trace. He checked the chamber and found no poison. There was no culprit to punish and no rule to cite. Zhao Wuji kept gagging and shaking on the ground. They had to drag him away. While holding their noses, John arrived. Late with his broom as if he had been sweeping the steps, he stood to the side with an empty expression. He spread his hands in innocent confusion. He spoke with that stiff accent and sounded sincere. I am only the sweeper. How would I know anything about a race? Maybe senior brother Zhao cultivated too hard. Maybe grain fasting went wrong and he ruined his gut. The discipline hall elder stared at John and found nothing to seize on. He swallowed his anger and accepted the humiliation. He waved his hand and ordered them to carry Zhao Wuji to a punishment cliff and keep him isolated. Zhao Wuji was still blasting as they hauled him away. John watched the mess on the ground. He lowered his head and kept sweeping. A thin trace of mockery flickered in his eyes and then disappeared. Zhao Wuji's latest disgusting farce had barely settled when a suffocating, terrifying pressure covered the entire Qingyun sect. The Blood Fiend sect sent a nascent soul realm envoy to force his way in under the name of a visit, while demanding the sect heirloom treasure whispered about. In legend, inside the grand hall, the air was heavy, like iron, and sect master Qing Yunzi had gone ghost pale with cold sweat sliding down his temples. Across from him, the envoy in a blood robe toyed with a skull artifact and smiled like it was all a joke. John was dragged in by discipline hall disciples. He clutched the cracked return origin stone to his chest and used his own true essence to barely steady the energy that had grown restless. After the spirit-gathering herb was lost a moment, he stepped over the threshold. Countless stares pierced him like needles. Before he could even speak, Qing Yunzi suddenly stood and pointed at John and shouted. He claimed the thing held by the foreign elder was the supreme treasure the Blood Fiend sect had been hunting. He hinted that John had been hoarding it in secret, and that was why the sect could not hand it over. The lie was so clumsy, even a child would laugh at it. To cultivators, the return origin stone was nothing but a useless rock, and only a transmigrator knew it carried space-time coordinates. Yet Qing Yunzi pushed John out without hesitation to take the blame and save himself. The Blood Fiend sect envoy did not care about truth or lies, and the savage light flashed in his eyes. He gave John no chance to defend himself and raised a hand to strike with palm thunder wrapped in bloody stench. In that instant, John moved by instinct and wanted to call up the vast real power inside his body and crush the attacker. Then he realized the return origin stone was balanced on a dangerously unstable edge. Any violent surge of spiritual power would make its inner structure collapse, and the road home would be severed forever. In a blink, John made his choice. He dispersed his protective true chi and turned his back. He curled his body into a tight ball and locked the stone against the softest place on his chest. A dull boom hit the hole, and the blonde, blue-eyed figure slammed into a coiled dragon pillar. John spat a mouthful of blood that soaked his washed-out robe. His calloused hands still clamped the stone like iron tongs and did not let it suffer even the slightest jolt. Agony tore through his meridians, but what he heard was the urgent voice of Qing Yunzi pressing him. The sect master did not lift a hand to save him, and instead scolded him harshly. He forced John to erase the divine sense imprint at once and offer up the treasure to beg for his life. John lifted his head with effort and stared at the hypocritical face twisted by fear. Then he looked down at the cold stone in his arms. In this world, only this stone had never betrayed him. In that moment, the last trace of warmth in his eyes went out, and a terrifying stillness took its place. John wiped the blood from his mouth, and his blue eyes were dead still. He rose from the broken rubble one slow inch at a time. Fire ripped through his organs, but his body did not truly collapse. 300 years of spiritual chi had tempered it into something stubborn and hard. He glanced at Sect Master Qing Yunzi, who was still screaming for him to hand over the treasure. Then he looked at the Blood Fiend sect envoy with that mocking smile. John pulled his mouth into a stiff, obedient curve. He lifted the cracked return origin stone with both hands. He trudged forward step by step like he was carrying a mountain. His head hung low, his posture screamed surrender. The envoy let out a shrill laugh. He mocked the righteous sect for having no spine. Greed spilled from his eyes. To him, this blonde barbarian was an ant delivering food. There was no spiritual power ripple on John at all. The envoy could not be bothered to raise protective true essence. He reached out with a hand as pale as a ghost claw. He grabbed for the return origin stone with zero caution. the instant his fingertips touched the stone. The dull haze in John's eyes snapped into clear cold focus. Divine sense that had slept for 300 years moved like a surgical blade. It pierced straight into the stone's core. It unlocked a tiny restriction hidden inside the return origin. Stone was not only a key that could take John home, it was also a vessel he used to collect tribulation lightning and convert it into energy. Now the violent thunder force stored for 300 years finally found a vent, a strip of lightning so white it could blind burst between them. There was no earth-shaking explosion, only a terrifying high hum from energy releasing all at once. The nascent Soul Realm envoy had no time to scream his protective magic treasure. Shattered like thin paper, his body was erased in an instant under pure heavenly tribulation. Thunder might even the nascent soul that tried to flee was wiped clean. The shockwave swept the grand hall. It ripped Sect Master Qingyunzi off the high seat and slammed him into the wall. The array disc of the Mountain Guardian array shattered on the spot. When the glare faded, only a heap of smoking black ash remained in the center of the hall. John stood there in silence. Aside from a few scorched marks on his sleeves, he was untouched. He bent down and picked up the return origin stone. From the ashes he brushed the dust off it with an almost casual grace. It was as if he had done something too small to mention. Qingyunzi stared at him in pure horror, like he had seen a ghost. John looked back without a hint of emotion. He gave a small shrug. He spoke in stiff, broken Chinese and explained in a flat voice, "I told you the treasure has a spirit, and it protects its owner. He insisted on taking it. The lightning killed him. That is not my fault." When John returned to the rear mountain forbidden grounds, the return origin stone was pulsing with a low beat. Like a heart, that tribulation lightning strike had drained the outer layers of stored tribulation thunder, but it also shattered the last spatial barrier deep in the stone's core. The cracks on the stone were healing fast enough to see a deep blue glow began to twist the void around it. The air carried the sharp bite of ozone and the taste of spatial turbulence. At last, the 300 years of holding back were about to end. A small figure in a pink Dao robe crawled out from the grass. Nian held a chipped porcelain bowl in both hands. Inside were a few dark healing pills that an outer disciple might get once a month. Dust and ash streaked her cheeks. She carefully pushed the bowl toward John. She called him weird martial uncle in a thin, frightened voice. John looked at his 7-year-old martial grandchild in a sect. This huge she was the only one who did not flinch at his blonde hair and blue eyes. She was the only one who still slipped him food. In secret, John did not take the bowl. He reached out and ruffled her messy hair instead. In the same heavy New York accent, he told her he was going very far away. He said that place had no flying swords and no spirit beasts, but it did have something called a hamburger. He said it was soft bread holding a juicy beef patty. He said you put melted cheese on it and pickles, and then you drink an ice-cold cola. He said one bite tastes like the civilized world. Nian listened with eyes wide and a little line of drool at the corner of her mouth. She asked if he could take her with him to eat that immortal pill called hamburger. John went quiet. He was about to answer when the ground under them began to shake. The bowl tipped and the pills scattered across the dirt. The clear sky above them flooded with blood-red color. Dozens of huge white bone-flying arc broke through the clouds. They came down like monsters crawling out of hell. They blotted out the light as they crushed toward the main peak. The warning bell screamed across the mountains. Then the first blast hit with a roar that shook the air. The Mountain Guardian array split open with a massive crack in the first round. The Blood Fiend sect had come for revenge faster than anyone expected. The envoy John killed had clearly sent a message before death. The return origin stone flared like it could not hold itself anymore. A black void rift tore open in front of John. Through it he could make out distant neon and flowing traffic. He could even hear the faint howl of cars. That was New York. That was home after 300 years. Behind him, the battle cries and the screams of dying people rolled together. The Qingyun sect was collapsing. In a wash of bloodlight, John stood up with the burning world at his back and the opening to freedom in front of him. He smoothed his torn Dao robe with slow hands. He told himself this was a barbarian war that had nothing to do with him. He told himself he was only a passerby who had gotten lost. Then a small voice tore through the noise with a raw, desperate scream. The foot John had already placed inside the void rift stopped in midair. A sharp crack sounded like the spine of the heavens, snapping. The pale blue barrier above the Qingyun sect did not break from outside. It exploded from within the main peak. A figure in a blue robe shot across the sky like a falling star. It was Qing Yunzi, the sect master. He did not draw a sword to face the enemy. He swept his sleeve and stole every treasure stored for 1,000 years to block the pursuers. He detonated the core array node of the Mountain Guardian array. Violent spiritual Qi turbulence roared and cut off the chase of the Blood Fiend sect. Elders Qing Yunzi did not look back even once. He fled straight toward the horizon old ancestor. While desperate howls rose from peak after peak, the answer was only the butcher blade falling from the sky with the array gone. The white bone flying arc dropped like grinding wheels. Thousands of outer disciples did not even raise a magic treasure. They turned into blood mist in the first wave of bombardment. The Qingyu mountain that once glowed with immortal grace became a slaughter hell. Severed limbs and torn flesh filled the stone steps where people once cultivated in silence. In the rear mountain forbidden grounds, the right foot of John was already inside the black void rift. John could almost feel a New York subway station for real. It was the modern world. It was the road home. One more step, and 300 absurd years would finally end. Everything being slaughtered here would have nothing to do with John Marshall. Uncle, save me! A weak but piercing cry cut through the screams and battle shouts. It stabbed straight into the ears of John. The body of John locked hard. The left foot of John rooted to the ground like it was nailed down. John turned in a stiff motion through cracks in collapsing rock. John saw the pink figure Nianyan lay beside the path down the mountain. A blood fiend sect disciple with a twisted face stood on the chest of Nianyan. He lifted a long blade that dripped blood and laughed. Beside the girl, a pool of blood spread across the stones. Two small arms lay in the blood without moving. Those severed hands still gripped a chipped porcelain bowl, the healing pills. Inside were already soaked through with blood. In the sky, the Blood Fiend sect raised the heaven-refining grand array over all directions. Dark red light poured down to refine every living thing on the mountain into a pill. John looked once at the neon flicker. Beyond the void rift, John looked once at the martial grandchild shaking and fainting from pain in the blood. 300 years of careful restraint and cold trade-offs shattered in a single moment. John pulled the right foot of John back from New York. Behind John, the void rift shook and started to close. The road home crumbled 1 inch at a time. John did not look back. John slowly drew the rusty iron sword used for chopping firewood. In the blue eyes of John there was no modern civility left at all. Only a madness more savage than this cultivation world. The screech of rust scraping steel cut through the battlefield noise. The iron sword in John's hand carried no spiritual chi at all. It looked like scrap metal picked up from a mortal farmhouse. In the next breath, the air tore open from pure force. A vacuum corridor split forward, as if the world had been carved hollow. The Blood Fiend sect disciple, who was about to swing a second strike, did not even finish his grin. His body split from the center of his forehead. The cut was so flat and clean that no blood burst out right away. John stepped over the corpse without slowing. Only then did the two halves slump down on either side. When John took that step, the rear mountain forbidden ground stopped being silent. A pressure like a raging sea erupted from the dead ground. The seal that John had suppressed for 300 years shattered in an instant. The fake and floating golden core realm aura began to surge like a broken dam. It rose into early nascent soul. It rose into mid nascent soul. It rose into late nascent soul. It did not stop until spirit transformation. Realm might slammed into the sky. The aura punched upward and forced a huge hole into the blood array overhead. This was not the 5-element spiritual power that this world understood. This was a purer and more tyrannical will to destroy. John did not look at the corpse at his feet. He bent down and gently set the two severed arms beside Nianyan. Then he turned toward the Blood Fiend sect disciples. Filling the mountain, several elite disciples of the Blood Fiend sect roared and rushed him. Flying swords and magic treasures rose together and flooded the air with brilliant light. John did not even raise protective aura. John only gave his wrist a small plain flick. The rusted iron sword became streaks too fast to track. There was no fancy sword chi. There were only physical cuts driven to the absolute limit. A crisp rain of metal chimes rang out in rapid bursts. Those natal treasures, tempered for 100 years, shattered in midair like brittle glass. Then came the wet hiss of throats tearing open. 7 elite disciples clutched their necks, their eyes filled with shock and fear they could not believe. They collapsed together like stalks cut at the base. Who are you? 3 protectors of the Blood Fiend sect shouted in fury. They exchanged one glance and moved as one. They raised the 10,000 souls blood banner. A skull 100 jang wide formed and dove down to bite. The surviving disciples of the Qingyun sect went pale with despair. This was a killing move. Even the sect master would never take head on. John did not retreat. John charged straight in. Cold blue eyes narrowed As if he were measuring the cleanest angle, he stomped the ground once his body shot upward like a cannon round. The iron sword stabbed up at an angle that looked wrong, but worked with terrifying efficiency. The strike held no ornament, yet it pierced the one blind spot in the flow of the banner power. A soft tearing sound answered the blood fog. Across the sky vanished in an instant. John turned in the air with a sharp corner that split the wind. The iron sword swept across 3 heads, rose into the air at the same moment. Only when the headless bodies crashed down did everyone finally see him clearly. The man Zhao Wuji mocked the barbarian waste. The whole sect laughed. Now stood alone in a sea of corpses. He held a rusted sword dripping blood. In one hand he looked down at them with the cold stillness of a foreign killing god. Xu Li, the master of the blood fiend sect, finally could not hold back anymore. A cold laugh slid out of his throat. He stepped across the void as if the air were stone under his feet. He did not strike John with his own hands. He snapped his sleeve and threw down a crimson coffin between them. The coffin hit like a falling boulder. The lid exploded apart. A stiff figure in an old Qingyun sect robe stepped out into the sunlight. When that paper pale face was exposed, the surviving disciples of the Qingyun sect began to wail. It was the former sect master Qingyunzi who had been missing for years. Now he was covered in corpse stains. Now his eyes held no mind at all. Now he was nothing but a corpse puppet built for slaughter. Shui Lai watched with open amusement. He was savoring the joy of making the old master butcher his own elders his hand. Seals shifted the corpse puppet. Qingyunzi let out the beast howl. He threw away all defense and became a stinking blood shadow that slammed straight at John. This spirit transformation realm corpse puppet had no elegance left. Every move was a trade of injury for injury. Every strike stabbed toward the left hand that John kept locked against his chest. John had to guard against the blood shadow blade of Shui Lai that came and went like a ghost. John had to break the relentless tangling of a puppet that did not feel pain. The rusted iron sword in his hand was fast, but every cut had to spare what he held close, so he was forced into a tight corner. With every breath, John frowned hard. The enemy was dangerous, but the pulsing inside the return origin stone was worse. Its energy wave grew more violent with every clash. Eli seemed to sense something unusual about the stone. He lifted a finger and tapped the air blood chi inside the corpse. Puppet Qingyunzi reversed at once. The puppet body swelled like it was being pumped full of air. It was going to blow itself apart at point-blank range. There was nowhere to dodge. John showed no hesitation at all. He spun around in a flash. He crushed his left hand against his chest. Like a lock, he used his back to meet the coming ruin head. On the blast hit with a thunder roar, flesh and bone sprayed through the air. John flew like a kite. With his string cut, he slammed into the ruins and rolled through broken stone. The shock shattered the protective aura on his back in one instant. The bones in his right arm twisted into a nightmare angle. Broken shards stabbed through skin and spilled blood down his sleeve. John did not spare the pain a single thought. He did not even bother to spit the clotted blood in his mouth. He only raised his left hand with a trembling breath. He looked at what he had protected his breathing. Froze solid. A thin crack had appeared on the surface of the return origin stone. The crack spread like a bright scar. Pure white spatial power leaked out like flowing sand. It was the signpost to New York collapsing in front of his eyes. 300 years of restraint, 300 years of hunger. In this moment, a wound opened that could never be mended. John slowly lifted his head. The calm ice in his blue eyes was gone. Only endless brutality and madness filled the place where reason used to live. If I cannot go back, then none of you get to live. John watched silver light dust slip through the gaps of his fingers. The last shred of reason drained out of his blue eyes. In its place came a dead calm that made the heart freeze. John closed his hand. Hard he crushed the return origin stone that had taken 300 years of his life. The vast power of space, meant to cross planes, burst out with no restraint. He forced all of it into meridians that were already dried out and scarred. A sigh like it came from ancient time rolled out of his chest. Every layered seal in his body that existed to hide from the heavenly Tao shattered. At once he stopped suppressing the terrifying realm that could grind a golden core realm to dust. The rusty iron sword in his hand trembled. The rust peeled away. A blade black as an abyss revealed itself. The golden core realm disguise collapsed in a blink. A boundless sword intent, born from the void, surged into the sky. It twisted the blood clouds into shredded scraps. The amusement on Shui Lai's face froze solid. He realized John was not running. He was folding space. One breath ago, John was 100 jang away. The next breath, that cold edge was already at his brow. This was the void sword intent. John had refined for 300 years. It existed for one purpose: to cut open the void and go home. The sword swept. Like it was nothing, there was no world-shaking blast. Only a thin black line sliced across the void. The spirit transformation realm corpse puppet that had just reformed jerked to a stop. Then the puppet and the space around it slipped out of alignment and slid apart. The cut was smooth like a mirror. Even the soul flame was erased by a single strike that carried the laws of space. Xu Li felt his courage break. He tried to turn into blood, escape, and flee. Then he found the space around him had already been locked by sword intent. Like an iron wall, the sword moved again. Protective demonic chi meant nothing. One arm tore free and a rain of blood shot into the air. John stepped on the broken remains of Qing Yunzi. Without a change in his face, he took one step forward. The ripples under his foot shattered every defensive magic treasure. Xue Li had John flip the sword in his hand. The tip pointed straight at the center of Xue Li's brow. He spoke in a flat voice that held no warmth at all. "You did not want me to live. Then die." The world seemed to slow. The flow of time felt like it was being dragged through cold water. A flash of frost bright edge cut through the air. A head that once ruled this world rolled across the ground. Xue Li's eyes stayed wide with rage and disbelief. As they stared into the sky, he could not accept that he died to a barbarian. With Xu Li dead, the heaven-refining grand array lost control. It detonated the earth veins with a roar. The sky over the Kanglan continent split open into a huge wound. A cruel joke played out in that instant. The destructive force resonated with the energy leaking from the shattered return origin stone. Above the collapsing cultivation world, a massive void rift opened slowly. It revealed what was on the other side. It was not chaos or empty darkness. It was neon light. It was jam taxis. It was the giant screen of Times Square. In a rainy night, John stood in a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. He was drenched in red. He held the black sword in his hand. He stared at the New York street that was close enough to touch and yet sealed away from him. Behind him, the Sect world cracked and sank. In front of him was the modern home he had dreamed of for 300 years between the two worlds. John laughed without a sound. The rain sounds of New York were clear as day. Flickering neon almost lit up the blood on his face. If he took one step, he could end the absurd nightmare of 300 years. He could go back to a world with air conditioning, cola, and the internet. John lifted his foot. The sole of his shoe still carried the blood of Xu Li. 1 meter ahead was a Manhattan street under the Statue of Liberty, martial ancestor. A thin thread of a voice cut through the howl of the spatial storm. It felt like an invisible cord wrapped tight around his ankle. John went stiff and slowly turned his head. Nian Nian was the little martial grandchild who always slipped him spirit fruit in secret. Now she lay in the shattered gate. Ruin's blood streamed from the stump of her severed arm. Her clear eyes held no fear of death. They held only complete trust and clinging devotion to him. Farther away, the earth veins were breaking. Heavenly fire poured back down into the world. The whole Kanglan continent was splitting apart. If he left right now, this world would be erased in 3 breaths. Nian Nian would be erased with it and become cosmic dust. The cheeseburger smell he had imagined for 300 years suddenly felt dull and empty. The dirt on Nian Nian's spirit fruit suddenly made it seem strangely sweet. John looked at the silver origin power gathering again in his palm. It was the last strength of the return origin stone. It was his only ticket home. It was also the only patch stone left to mend the sky. John muttered a curse in his native tongue. A relieved, helpless, bitter smile pulled at his mouth. He spun around hard. He faced away from the window into modern civilization. He burned the last thread of potential in his body. He threw himself at the collapsing heavens. He rose like a meteor, forcing its way upstream. In the roar of the world ending, he slammed that blazing silver light into the torn seam of the sky seal. For me, his hoarse roar ripped out of his throat. Blinding white light stitched the heavens shut in an instant. The New York street scene twisted in the glare. It shrank smaller and smaller. Then it vanished completely. The road home was sealed away in the depths of time and space. All his cultivation scattered in that moment. John fell from the sky like a kite. With its string cut, his mind sank into endless darkness. 10 years later, the Qingyun sect was rebuilt. On the ruins, its fortune and presence were greater than before. The rear mountain forbidden grounds was no longer desolate. It had become the holy land of the sect. Morning sunlight spilled across the stone steps. An old man with silver hair and rough cloth clothes held a broom. He swept fallen leaves at a slow, steady pace. His steps were unsteady. There was no spiritual power ripple on him at all. He looked like a mortal at the end of his life. A few passing inner disciples stopped when they saw him. Their faces turned solemn. They bowed deeply together. They said in one voice, "Greetings, Elder John." The old man paused his broom. Those blue eyes still reflected drifting clouds and rolling sky. He smiled gently in fluent Chinese. He told them, "Do not be late for morning lessons." He glanced at the quiet mountains. He thought of how he would never taste a real cheeseburger again. Then he breathed in the mountain wind and felt it cool on his face. This breeze is not bad either.